On today's agenda, these are a few of the things we're going to discuss based around the data, but also getting Nelson's insights into how we can tackle these issues. So, why that disruption is happening so fast, where organizations tend to go wrong, why skills are so important to employees today, the barriers that we typically face to closing skills gaps, and why skills initiatives struggle to make an impact a lot of the time. So if you do have any questions, I'm going to switch off the chat now because the Q&A will be easier and you can just drop your questions into the Q&A so we can get to them at the end. But Nelson, while I stop sharing my screen and go back to the panelist view, why do you think this skills disruption is happening so hard and so fast based on those numbers that we just saw?
It's a big old question to kick things off with, Jeremy. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of things changing at the same time. That's kind of created this perfect storm. And just to break down some of those things, and some of them are probably quite obvious, right? There's exponential technological change, not just in AI. There's a whole bunch of like nuclear fission. There's a whole different bunch of technologies that are advancing very, very rapidly. Combine that with the fact that globalization is also growing. So essentially, if you're working even in a startup or a scale up, you're thinking global from day one, especially if you're offering a tech service like a software or a consumer tech product. Then there's a massive shift that's happening in demographics, right? There's a concern around a lot of experienced talent in an aging population and now leaving the workforce. And we haven't got enough people in that middle who've kind of gained a bit of experience. So we've got really early new talent, or we've got people who are leaving the organization. So there's that demographic shift. There's also the demographic shift around the type of workers we now have, right? More and more people going freelance, contracting, and less people considering, being a permanent employee is the only thing that you can do. Then the traditional education not keeping up with all of these changes, which is often the common complaint, and that's still true, right? We've got education that's not keeping up with the speed of industry. Some countries have been better at dealing with that because there's a far closer relationship between industry and traditional education. But those who don't have a good relationship between industry and traditional education are going further and further back. Then there's government policies, things like immigration, regulations around tech. So you can see there's a long list of things. And now you bring all of this together, and the kind of output you get is essentially a tight labor market, right? And in essence, what that means is there aren't enough qualified humans to do the jobs that we need them to do for all of these different reasons. And so while the world constantly changing, we're not able to produce humans who are able to do those jobs. Now you combine that macro situation with the micro situation within companies, where there's a statistic that shows over 70% of companies said they lost talent because of a lack of growth opportunities. So what that tells us is a lot of companies are really bad at supporting the growth and development of their employees, but because there's so much job opportunity out there for the people with the right skills, employees are leaving companies and they're walking and walking until they find the right company that's going to support their growth. And so the combination of companies being really bad at doing the learning and development side of things and the market having so much opportunity now means companies are really in for skills disruption. That's happening really fast. And so that's the kind of combination that's kind of taken us here. And to anyone who's sitting there thinking, is this a phase? You can look at reports and data reports that came out a decade ago. And actually the story is the same, right? It was getting faster. And the only thing that's happened really is the half-life of our skills has got lower, not higher, which says we're actually getting worse. This problem's getting worse and we've not got any better at solving it.
Yeah, to that point, there's some other data that I don't have to hand, but it was those leaders believe that it's less than 2 years now, a skills relevant. Most of them saying a year and a half. So, yeah, completely agree. And I want to pick up on the point you made around employers who aren't offering the chance to build skills are shooting themselves in the foot in many ways. And this is spilling over into employees who don't have confidence in their organization to build skills. So I'll put this data in the chat so that people can see it and refer to it as we talk through it. But Only 39% believe that their employer invests in building the skills they need to advance in their career. And that number was 51% last year. So while the need to build skills has sped up, the faith that organizations can help employees build skills has gone down. And 54% said their employer had given them sufficient opportunities to learn new skills, despite 74% expressing a desire to develop skills. So it really feels like organizations are falling short, and this is affecting employee confidence in their employer to build skills. So why are we falling short, and what are some of the reasons this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, we get to, we're fortunate enough to get to speak to a lot of L&D and HR professionals. And there's a range of reasons that are coming up, surprisingly. But one was there's the age-old saying, which is, what if we invest in their skill development and they leave? But then the saying goes, what if they stay? And surprisingly, I've heard that as a blocker, where some companies are not putting in the investment because they're worried about what if they leave, which seems counterintuitive. And so I was quite surprised to hear that. But the other reasons is actually it's a change in approach, right? To go from, especially if you're an L&D function that's predominantly quite operational. By that, what I mean is, a large part of your remit is compliance. Another part of your remit might be procuring, learning, or maybe you've got instructional design facilities, so you're creating a lot of your content. And so if you've been very operationally heavy, to move to an approach where you're now focused on skills development, it's a far more strategic role. And so it might be the fact that either the function doesn't have the capabilities or the buy-in to be given the space to be strategic within their organization. So it's a change management process, both in terms of how L&D sees itself within the organization, but also how the rest of the organization sees L&D's role within the organization. And I think there seems to be, from the conversations I'm having, there's a lot of friction in changing that perception. It's been really hard. And also the data has been a massive blocker here. In a lot of organizations, they're not currently measuring skills, right? So a lot of whether they have a skills gap or not, it's based on opinions, right? You've had a handful of managers who've said, I think we have the skills gap. And they've it's a bit like you self-diagnosing yourself based on symptoms and going to Google or ChatGPT and saying that here are my symptoms, what do I have? That's basically what's happening is managers and heads of departments are looking at performance, self-diagnosing that I think this skills gap, and there's some merit to that, but you've also got to bear in mind this is a person's opinion and there could be bias there, and it's not backed by objective measurement or metric that can support this hypothesis. And because there isn't the data to build a more robust picture of the skills you have and don't have in your organization, you don't have the foundation to be able to drive a skills development strategy, right? And not just to build the strategy, but also to convince your executive team and get the buy-in that this is what we need to do. And I think the lack of data infrastructure, but also in some cases, the lack of data literacy skills within certain kind of the L&D and people function in some organizations is holding them back from being able to put a compelling case forward to invest more in skill development. So there's a couple of the reasons that I'm hearing from speaking to a lot of L&D teams.
Yeah, I think that probably trickles down to the employees who then don't have the faith because what they're seeing doesn't feel like it's related to their career growth in a tangible way or the job they do. Because, like you said, if we don't have insights onto skills people need for a role or insights into the skills they need to perform a role, then we won't deliver things that are relevant. And then, of course, then, we've been, before we even sort of spoke about it in a skills sense, we were talking about the pitfalls of irrelevant learning, disengaging people, but this is doing it in a different way. It's kind of destroying their confidence that the skills they know might become redundant are going to be future-proof by what they do at work or learn at work, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, it goes back to the traditional approach to L&D has very much been a content-first approach, right? The question that we've historically asked is what content does this employee need and how am I going to get this content to them? Which completely ignores the context, right? The business context of, what is the strategy of the business and do we have the skills to deliver that strategy or not, right? That's fundamentally what the business cares about. It's what the employees care about. And that gives us the context within which our learning and development initiatives exist. And without that context, it increases the probability of you pushing the wrong learning to the wrong person at the wrong time. When you're getting that many things wrong, you can't get a lot right. And so that's where we need to really shift towards a skills first approach, where we are now getting an idea of the context by looking at things like what are the skills that the business needs to deliver the strategy? What are the skills that we actually have? Then identify the gaps and connect our L&D strategy to bridging those gaps within the organization. I think without that context, we essentially end up with what we've spoken about before on the show, which is the engagement gap, right? Which is the engagement gap is every time you're pushing stuff out and no one's engaging with it or getting value from it, it's essentially a waste of time and resources of the organization. It also makes it a lot harder for you to engage employees in learning moving forward, because the more crap you throw at someone, they put their barrier up. And so it actually gets harder to throw crap at them because they're putting their barrier up and they get desensitized or immune to what internal L&D is offering. And that's where you end up with statistics like the ones you shared, Gary, where it's people losing confidence in an organization's ability to be able to help them build the skills they need. And so some of it is changing that strategic approach for L&D in your organization. And once you've done that, and maybe you do have the buy-in, it makes sure you have the tech stack, right? If you don't have the tech stack to support your strategy, and this is where often I see organizations fall into the trap of sunk cost fallacy, right? Like we bought this traditional LMS and we have to stick with it, even if it's not going to support us in driving skill development, right? Again, it holds you back. It ruins your reputation internally. And I hear this a lot with internal L&D who've kind of either inherited, right, or locked themselves in to tooling that doesn't support them to drive skill development.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of a nice segue in some ways because often we try to cater to what matters to employees and try and help them be successful and buy the tech that helps them succeed to offer the benefits that help them succeed. But in terms of progress, employees, according to this data, flag that they care a lot more about skills than they do about promotions, which shows a real huge shift actually, because 79% of UK employees think a new skill will help their career in the next 12 months, compared to just 67% who said a promotion would be best for their growth. And 51% said they're happy to stay in a role, even if there's no room for that traditional progression, while 72% want to improve their skills through training and development. So, we kind of covered the employer lens there of how they move to this skills, but why do you think employees are shifting their priorities towards skills so much?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because often we overlook what's in it for them. Like, why do the employees care? And so skills isn't just beneficial for the organization, the L&D and HR team. There's actually logical reasons for why a skills first approach is better for the employee. So let's break down some of those reasons. First one is going back to what I just said earlier around fundamentally, you want to make sure in an organization you have the skills to deliver your strategy. And as an employee, more of the skills I have that help an organization deliver that strategy, the more valuable I am to the company, right? And so in terms of really looking at whether am I going to stay in this company, am I going to grow in value, am I going to get pay rises, and all of that growth that matters to an employee comes from the value I bring to the table, which is in the skills, not in the job title, right? So first thing is skills, more varied skills, more depth in skills makes me more valuable to the current company I'm in. The second thing is if you take job titles, right? There are some job titles that haven't changed in the last 2 decades, right? Let's take ones like product designer or a project manager. These job titles haven't changed in decades. But if you look at the tasks that these jobs are now doing and the skills required to do those tasks, they've changed significantly, right? So aspiring for a job title doesn't reflect the tasks and skills required in the broader job market. So as an employee, I'm more valuable in the job market the more skills I have. Because let's say, for example, I'm in a company where the job title um, has tasks that haven't really progressed, right? They're not using modern methods in project management, let's just say, as an example. That's not as transferable because all I have is the way that this company used to do project management, and that doesn't make me as valuable in the broader job market. But if I've increased my skills and diversified the skills that I have, based on the task you would expect in a broader job market, it now makes me more valuable, not just for my company, but more valuable in the job market. Right. So both are ways, skills is a way for you to increase your value in both the outside world as well as inside the organization. The other thing skills gives an employee is control over their career, right? When you're hiring based on a job title, I could be fighting with hundreds, thousands of people for the job title. But when you're building the skills you have, you become a brand, right? I'm no longer hiring a content marketer. I'm hiring Gary, right? There's a big difference between that, right? It's a difference between bringing in someone who has skills and essentially is a company of one, right? And so building skills becomes a key competitive advantage and differentiator for every single one of us, right? Where we're no longer a replaceable person who can fill a role. We're now someone who has all these different assets, which is valuable both inside this company and outside. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that also the nature of work has massively changed, right? Once upon a time, you used to have people who stay in the same company for their entire life, right? That is a massive rarity now, right? More and more people now, modern careers are very squiggly. And people like to change not just roles within the function they exist in, but they like to change functions. They like to completely change the career they're doing, which means you need continuous skill development. And I think all of these different factors has meant that employees appreciate they need skills over promotions. It's just the organizations are falling behind in supporting that.
Yeah, you know what? That I agree with all of that. And the first one really made me think that actually, for an employee, typically if you say you want a new title, new salary, then you go into the conversation and then you have to prove that you have the skill or you've hit the target or you performed. But actually, if you focus on skills, well, the byproduct of skills is that you reach your goals, and the sort of byproduct of that is that you're more likely to get promoted. So not only are you probably increasing your chances of getting to that promotion, like you say, you're future-proofing yourself that um, if you had to leave and go elsewhere, you would have the skills needed on a more universal level. So, yeah, I can completely understand why that's happening. There's another take as well, I guess, is if you get promoted in the traditional sense, and it just means a job title that's higher, but you're managing people. In some ways, you're actually further away from the ability to apply skills because typically you're doing less of the frontline stuff and more of the tactical or managing team or managing people stuff. So actually, I think that might be part of it as well. Is if you get that traditional promotion, you're actually less likely to be able to apply skills, and it still doesn't protect you from your skills becoming redundant, even though you got the new title, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it also points towards how the traditional linear career frameworks um, don't support the continuous growth that individuals need to go through, right? Let's say your traditional career framework might have, say, 5 to 7 levels, and that almost limits my growth to only 5 to 7 milestones, and it's very linear, right? But a skills-based approach to career growth is continuous, right? There might be always skills that I can add, which allows me as an individual to contribute more value to my organization. And so there's probably also from a people perspective for us to evaluate how we think about career growth and growth inside a company. It's not about me moving from engineer level 1 to an engineer level 2. It actually might be even within the remit of the work I'm doing, there might be 10 more skills that I need to either get better at or new skills that I need to add to my repertoire, right? And I think that's what this limiting approach, because we still see, right now at How Now, we're in the process of launching in our platform career paths. And we've been speaking to a lot of people around how they think about it, where our worldview of career paths is a skills-based approach to career path, right? Where I'm now looking at, based on my skills profile, what are the other roles that I have a 70% match for, an 80% match for? And that could be roles that exist within a completely different jobs family or department or function. And why shouldn't that be allowed, right? Why are we limiting it to only these next five things that are in my spreadsheet that tells you what the career framework is? And I think that, again, requires change management within organizations to look at people as kind of from a skills-based lens, which opens up a ton of opportunities for an organization.
That leads us nicely onto where organizations are struggling when it comes to closing their skills gaps, because there's some overlap between these big reasons and some of the stuff you just mentioned there and early on. So I'll drop these in the chat for people to see. But the biggest one was lack of budget, 44%. Lack of team bandwidth to manage L&D programs came next at 39. Ability to identify effective L&D solutions was next at 33. The same amount said high employee turnover was stopping them closing skills gaps. And last of all, 29% lack of support from leadership. You did mention this in passing earlier, but are any of these standing out to you, Nelson, and sort of advice for tackling them?
Yeah, it's hardly surprised me, actually. I was also quite surprised by ones that weren't there. For example, from a actually, it might be down to the inability to identify effective L&D solutions, but I do think there's a big problem from getting relevant data that helps organizations run effective skill development programs. And I think basics, like you achieve what you measure. And if you're not measuring skills, how can you achieve skill development? And in many organizations, that basic isn't there. And in some organizations who we speak to who are about to go on that journey or in the process of going through that journey, there's still kind of friction around who owns this, right? Who owns the skills project and where should it sit? And how do we make sure we get the maximum engagement from employees and the maximum executive buy-in? And so I see that as a blockade, that kind of this new thing. How do we figure out who owns this and how do we bring it into the organization? But looking at some of the things that have come up here, lack of budget. Again, I see this more as a lack of ability to get buy-in, or in some cases, just not getting the buy-in, right? And this comes down to how L&D markets itself, right? We've got to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture. In many organizations, they've got used to seeing L&D as a cost center that delivers compliance and maybe a bit of product training and a bit of leadership training that's been given top down, right? The executive team have given the order to say, we want this, and you're essentially an operational execution machine. Now, when you're talking about skills, like I mentioned before, it's far more strategic. And so you need to rebrand L&D within your organization and change the perception and build a business case that's a lot more strategic in order to get that buying and consequently budget. So I'm not surprised by the lack of budget, given some of the stories I hear around the friction to get buy-in. Now, the lack of team bandwidth, again, I think this is connected to your tech stack. Again, right? If you're doing, like recently I was having a conversation with a couple of L&D teams where they were talking about how much of their week is still in doing admin work in L&D. Like if you've got a new cohort of employees joining every week and you're spending, say, even a day a week setting up, okay, this person needs to be added onto this onboarding, and you're doing that manually, then you're running reports from like 5 different systems. If most of your week is taken up by those admin routine tasks, yeah, I can see why you don't have the bandwidth to do strategic. But I think what you need to recognize is the first thing to get cut is a cost center, right? And so if what you're doing is a lot of admin stuff that one day IT can automate, then that's the first thing to go. And L&D really, at the minimum level, should be a value center, not just L&D. HR should be, at the very least, a value center. And to be able to do that, you really do need to reflect on, are you doing the urgent, unimportant stuff? Or are you doing the important stuff that is time sensitive, that needs to be prioritized? To really evaluate the team bandwidth, because this is a recurring theme I hear from L&D professionals, is time management. I've got so much to do, so much of it is manual. How do I start working on a skills-first approach to L&D? Yeah. And the other thing around the team bandwidth is, asking the question of how much of what you're doing actually delivers business value, right? Like how much of it is just output, right? You're just churning out stuff. You're a bit of a production facility, just creating hundreds of courses and training programs, and you're doing a ton of stuff. But if you ask the executive team what value you brought to the business, could they tell you, right? So the reality might be actually you need to focus on doing this stuff that's going to deliver outcome rather than output. So yeah, there's some of the thoughts that have come up from this. The high employee turnover one is an interesting one, right? Because essentially the high employee turnover touches on where we started this conversation, where people are leaving because they don't feel their growth is being supported. They're going to other companies where their growth might be supported. And so you're now trying to fill that gap. But this is where you need to be careful, where companies by default try to buy skills, right? They think it's easier to recruit for those skills rather than build them internally. And I think this is where your business case needs to be backed by data, because the data says it's far more competitive and expensive to buy those skills and borrow those skills than it is for you to be able to build those skills. And it really is going back to that point around buy-in. You need to put the business case to your executive team to say, this isn't sustainable. We can't keep buying, and this is the cost of buying talent. We now need to invest in building those skills internally.
Yeah, I'm so glad you made that point around perspective and taking a step back, because that was the common thread I saw through here. Lack of budget is perceived as we don't have the money, but actually, are we spending the money that would solve this problem on something less effective that doesn't have impact? We don't have bandwidth because we're doing a million things, but how many of those things are worth our time? I say this with full self-awareness. This is exactly what I had to do recently with like a lot of the tech I use and the things I do. But yeah, like the ability to identify an effective solution is maybe you just don't have that foundation of the skills, data, or the strategy that you're going to do and you're going to implement. And then lack of support from leadership. If you're just churning out stuff and they don't see impact, then they might see that this is just another thing that's going to have little value but lots of effort. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think taking a step back and just really auditing what you do and don't do. I mean, when we launched the boot camp at the start of the year, that was the first thing, was to sit down and reflect on what do you spend lots of your time on, out of that stuff, what's worth your time, and then channeling that extra energy and effort into skills.
It's a good, simple, but powerful, reflective question to ask yourself. I mean, we could all do it today, right? Like, after this, just take a moment to ask yourself, how do I know if what I'm doing is actually working? Right? That question will force you to first define what working means, right? And that might open up the fact that actually your definition of working isn't the same as your executive team's definition of working, right? So there you go. That's the first problem. There's a misalignment here, right? What they consider as value is not what you consider as value. So that's your first problem to solve. Get that alignment, right? Then it might bring about the fact that you come up with the right answer for example, how you know what it's working. But then it might make you realize you're not actually measuring the thing that's going to tell you whether this is working or not. And so I think it's a great reflective question, just to pause, right? Just to pause and this is what I talk about in my book, Learning at Speed, right? Is lean learning is about doing the things that matter whilst reducing waste, right? And waste is anything that's not moving the needle on impact. And that comes from continuously asking that question of, how do I know if it's working or not? And if it's not working, I need to cut it as quickly as possible. And if it's working, I need to double down on it.
Yeah, exactly. And if people, there are a couple of questions to this point, but if people want some starting points that are allowing them to test whether skills work before they invest lots of time and effort into it and do it fast, then the guide that I linked in the chat, there's a section on that where people can start. Nelson, I've got one more data point that I wanted to discuss with you, and then we'll move to Q&A. So we've already got lots of questions, but if anyone wants to drop any more in the Q&A, we'll get to as many as we can. But the last one is around why skills initiatives tend to have such little impact. So anyone who reads the LinkedIn Workplace Learning Report, for the last 3 years, they've had this question around where your skills initiative is in a stage between haven't started it, planning, activation, and measurement. And this is the third year in a row that fewer than 5% have advanced far enough to even measure success. 41% this year were stuck in the planning phase, 50% were stuck in the activation phase. So Why are businesses, when it comes to skills, getting stuck in these two strategic parts as opposed to the implementation and measurement part?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what we've discussed around now, like the lack of right tech stack or infrastructure, the lack of strategic alignment internally, or the buy-in from the executive team, the changing culture and mindset, the perception of L&D. Do you have the right talent to be able to drive this change? So it's a lot of what we've discussed. The other thing I'd add to this is we really need to take a more lean and agile approach, right? One of my favorite sayings is think big, start small, right? You might have this vision for like transforming your organization's skill development strategy, mapping your entire organization, plugging every skills gap that exists, but you got to start small, right? And you start small and you get buy-in by doing, right? Not by writing a 50-page plan on how you're going to change the world, but by doing, right? And that's where I think often the kind of discussions I have with L&D professionals is there's not enough of a bias towards action. Instead, there's too much of a bias towards perfection, right? Like I'm going to spend so much time in this upfront planning stage to make sure the day I push this out, it's just going to be perfect. Everyone's going to be raving about it. Now, what I can tell you and what data can tell you is even when you take 6 months, 12 months, years, it's still not going to be perfect, right? Because you're essentially trying to come up with the perfect strategy and implementation of it in a vacuum, right? You're not putting it out there with real people. You're not getting the feedback to iterate on. And so what I'd recommend is starting small. If you want to know, if you know this is where you want to get to, then come up with a way of how you can validate this. Maybe it's with a small group. Maybe it's with a subset of skills. Maybe it is a subset of job roles that you want to target. And then play it out. And I can definitely guarantee, learn more through that experience than you could have sitting in a bunch of different planning meetings over the next couple of years. And get real feedback, implement that, iterate, go back out there again. And that will help you go through the cycle, right? So rather than getting stuck at planning, it will help you go beyond that into implementation, gather data, go back into planning. And I think this is where, again, I recommend taking a sprint model, right? Of, you can have 2 to 4 week sprints where you set yourself a goal for a certain group of people. You're going to run that sprint, look at what you learn at the end of it, make some changes and go in. And it might seem counterintuitive, but it's how you go slow to go fast, right? You do the upfront learn, which also reduces wastage, and it also helps you get buy-in. But because there's nothing like going to your executive team and go, actually, I've done this, and the data shows this is working. So now I need more budget, more resources to scale this. That has far less perceived risk than me coming to a big slide deck and saying, I need loads of money and loads of resources to make this happen, but I've not really done anything to de-risk this.
Yeah, funny enough, I think it says around this data point in that LinkedIn report that they're calls them weighty initiatives that are trying to reskill hundreds and thousands or thousands of people at once, and begs the question, why? Why are you trying to do it for hundreds or thousands of people at once if you don't have a proven approach for it works, or you're at a starting point? Yeah, to your point, can you find one problem in the business where if we solve that, it'd have a big impact, and we think building skills could solve that, and then we can take that to other people and say, look, we solved this problem for this person. And to the point you made earlier, now we can show real impact because it's connected to a business outcome. So yeah, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot a little bit by trying to do it at scale rather than, like you say, learning and iterating.
I think the point you made there, Gary, about the business outcome is such a key one because fundamentally the business wants to drive business performance, right? And if you work backwards to be able to drive that business performance, they need to make sure they have the right skills. And to have the right skills, they need to make sure people are learning the right stuff to build those right skills. So the thing that connects what we do in L&D to business performance is skills, right? It's not the fact that I completed this course or completed this training program. That's not what connects to the business performance. It's whether that learning gave me the skills at a level I needed to be able to drive that business performance. And that's what connects the dots. And connecting those dots is what fundamentally demonstrates value, impact to your organization.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and not to make this about how now, but this is a good segue to mention that actually one of the reasons people get so stuck in this early planning stage is because they are trying to measure skills for everyone manually at one time, and it's just not feasible to do that quick enough to have impact, is it? So, yeah, maybe just a quick insight, Nelson, into how we help companies map and measure skills might be interesting to people.
Yeah, 100%. So we help organizations figure out answers to three questions, right? What skills do they need to deliver their strategy? What skills do they actually have in the organization? And then how do you bridge that gap by connecting people with relevant learning? They're the three things we help companies do. As a result of it, they can bridge gaps, build the skills they need to be able to drive performance and deliver their strategy. Now, specifically around the kind of skills mapping piece, it'll be great to know in the chat if many of you've got kind of skills taxonomies or skills ontologies and where you are in that particular journey. But what we do with the organizations we work with is we look at real-time labor market data. So we collect and analyze millions and millions of job adverts. And then we break those job adverts down to a library of tasks. Because like I mentioned earlier, the job title might not change, but the task that that person has to do can significantly change. Then when we look at the task, based on the task, we infer using large language models what skills are required and to what proficiency level do you need that skill to be able to deliver that particular task or to execute that particular task. Now, with that data, you can now map, connect that with your HR system talent data, and you can now map your entire organization based on what skills they need to have to get the job done, right? And then you can combine that with skills assessment. So, we support organizations to run a very light touch 360 skills assessment so they can continuously monitor and track what skills they actually have in the organization. But that's your kind of foundation, right? In order for you to be able to connect people with relevant learning, you need to answer the question of how do I deem something relevant? And then let's take out compliance, right? Let's take out the top-down stuff. It is what it is. You're going to assign it. That's what deems it relevant. But beyond that, you need to be able to drive skills-based learning recommendations. And to drive skills-based learning recommendations, you need to know people's skills gaps. And that is the first step for you in this journey.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nelson. I'm going to launch a poll now. So if any of that resonated with you or those sound like problems you're trying to overcome, if you just click yes to this poll that you'd like to know a bit more about How Now and our One Home for Learning and Skills, then one of us will in the team will be in touch with you shortly after this session. Cool. Nelson, we'll move on to the Q&A. We've got loads of questions flying in. I jinxed it the other day. I said to someone, webinars are normally quite quiet. You only get like towards the end people, but yeah, thank you for so many great questions. Two of these I'm going to combine, Nelson, at the start here. If someone has nothing in place, what are the starting points to identify skills that they need across the business?
So first thing, if you have nothing in place, it's not a bad thing, right? It just means you've got less baggage to deal with. And sometimes it's a lot easier to start from a blank canvas than it is to start with baggage. So don't worry about the fact that you've got nothing in place. The first thing I'd say is putting in place that kind of the skills and learning infrastructure there, right? So you need to be able to, going back to the question I mentioned, you need to first know what skills people need to do their job, right? So you need a skills taxonomy at the very least, but ideally an ontology that tells you for this job role, these are the skills that are required. Now, traditionally, people have approached this by going to heads of departments and managers and going, you tell me what skill this person should have. I wouldn't recommend that because it's very, very time consuming. Also introduces a lot of biases because, a manager is basically going, yeah, I think this person needs a level 4 in negotiation skills to do their job. So there's a lot of bias. And often what you find is every manager and head of department thinks they're special. And so they want to call a skill differently or have different levels, etc. And so it's really important to have a foundational data set that gives you that mapping to take out the biases and the baked-in assumptions that might come with individual opinions. So I think that's a good starting point. Another one from a learning perspective is if you have a lot of learning sources, like content sources, like you've got mentoring coming from one place and third-party content libraries. I'd say creating that single front door for learning is really, really important because time poor employees and any amount of friction that makes it difficult for them to find relevant learning is going to put them off. Right? They're not going to look through 5 different places to find what they need. So you need to be able to bring all your scattered learning together into a single place. Make sure it's mapped to your skills language. So all of your learning opportunities are speaking the same skills language, which then makes it easy for you to connect relevant learning to the gaps that you then identify. And so I think building that tech infrastructure that's going to help you do this efficiently and effectively is really important. Now, there's a lot more insights. In the reason why we've got the guide coming out around skills-driven growth is to bring all of those best practices from people who've done it into one practical guide. And so, you can go through that and feel free to let us know if you've got any questions or want to have a chat to deep dive into how to go about applying some of those things.
Cool. Thanks, Nelson. This is sort of similar, but it's, once you have got your hands on those business goals, you know what they are. How do you then channel that into your L&D strategy so that what you are creating is directly linked to those overall company goals?
Yeah, and often problems with people not engaging with learning, my learning is not driving the right value, do come at a strategy level, right? They're often because the strategy is either focusing on the wrong business problem or it's targeting the wrong internal customers. And so it's important for you to make sure you're collaborating when you're coming up with that L&D strategy. And a few things to focus on is a good definition of what is the business problem or challenge that you're trying to solve, right? To give you an example here, let's say you're trying to, the problem is there's a low win rate in sales. Let's say that's the problem you're trying to solve. And then you're trying to break down, okay, what is the cause of that problem? Right? Is it because we've had feedback that we're losing deals because we can't talk about the product properly, or we're losing deals because we can't negotiate it? Whatever those gaps are, and you need the data to back that, and that's where the skills measurement comes in, because you can look at the business problem, then look at your workforce through the lens of skills and see that, all right, these gaps are probably the reason why we're having this business problem, and that kind of builds your narrative for. Well, then the story is if we bridge some of these gaps, we should start to see an improvement on the win rate, which should increase our revenue because we're winning more sales. And the key thing there is you need to think about what you're going to measure from the get-go. Too often I speak to L&D professionals who think about measurement after the fact, right? After they've built the learning, they've pushed it out, and now they're thinking about how do I measure the outcome? But it needs to be there from the get-go. Now, going back to my sales example, it might mean that you start with a baseline, where let's say our win rate today is, let's say, 10%. The desired outcome is we want to move this to 30%. So while you're implementing your L&D strategy, you can continuously measure that metric, working with your revenue leader or sales leader to see whether what you're implementing from an L&D strategy is moving the metric that matters to the organization. We've got a resource on our site called the Learning Canvas. I think we've got a session coming up as well, which is all about how you can use a one-page template to design and develop your L&D strategy in collaboration. If you are interested, drop us a note and we'll be in touch with the upcoming date on that if you are interested in designing your L&D strategy.
Cool. Nelson, I will not paraphrase this one because there's some useful insights and context in it, but it says, I appreciate the insights on employees being valuable assets as individuals rather than being easily replaceable in their roles, i.e. hiring for a content marketer versus hiring Gary. That added to the natural progression of attrition from a company point of view, how do we ensure that we continue to have a healthy pipeline of employees? I wonder if there's an overlap here between what we spoke about recently around hiring for skills. Not just soft skills, but actually moving away from what does someone need to do this role and testing for that in the interview process, maybe.
Yeah, there's definitely hiring for skills is one thing, because often, we've seen, and there's a lot of data around this as well, around the interview process doesn't actually, it's looking for certain things that might not be reflected in the skills that have been mapped to that particular job role within the organization. So making sure it's skills based is translated across the entire employee experience from recruitment all the way to talent mobility. And this is a really important one, is in order to be able to, if you're dealing with high employee turnover and you've now got gaps in the business to get certain jobs done, it's even more important for you to know not what job title can get that task done, but to know what skills are required to get that task done. Because there might be other people in the organization who have that particular skill, right? And that's why you need a skills-based approach to talent mobility. And so rather than limiting it, saying, only a content marketer can do what a content marketer is doing, you might actually find someone who's in demand generation has also got the skill of social media planning, let's say, as an example. And so by looking at people from the lens of skill, you can now go, okay, I need this skill to execute this task. Who else in my organization has that particular skill? Let me either move them into that or let them pick that up as a project. And so that's why the skills-based view of your workforce is really critical to support you in bridging those gaps and making sure you're not caught out in a position where you don't have the skills to get basic work done in your organization.
Yeah, it's interesting the phrasing was around pipeline, but like you say, it relates to internal pipeline of employees as well, because we know employees want opportunities. We know that employees want collaboration and connection, and actually knowing which skills can be leveraged across the business gives you more chance to say that person can do that and this other team. Now we don't need to have the situation where they say, oh, I could have done that, or I missed out on a chance to kind of work on a new project. Yeah.
I mean, there's an important thing here as well, which requires change management, because there is also a perception in some organizations that I will only do what is to do with my job title, right? That is also the limiting belief of taking a job-based approach to the workforce. Whereas a skills-based approach it's not limiting. You're going to be given projects or tasks that fit your skills, right? So it's not that this is not my responsibility because it's not in my job title, or it wasn't in the job advert. It's like, you've got this skill, we need someone with this skill to do this, and therefore we're going to connect you to that project. And so it opens up the opportunity of really unlocking potential and tapping into the whole self of an employee and what they can offer.
This next one is, I don't know if you've seen anything on this, Nelson, but whether there are specific skills employees are looking to get better at.
Yeah, there's definitely ones around so creativity. There's a lot of what you would call, different people call it different ways. It's called soft skills, human skills, power skills. But in essence, the things that might actually be harder for generative AI or AI, at least for now, to be able to replicate. Like, let's take, for example, if you're using ChatGPT or any other generative AI tool, it still requires a level of critical thinking and judgment to decide whether is this good or not, right? And so building those skills is where I'm seeing a lot of demand right now. And obviously, the nature of what we do, we get to see a lot of data around what type of learning people are doing and what skills is that learning related to. Creativity has been on a growing trajectory. And looking into research around this, it's because right now we're living in a world that's very, very uncertain. And so to be able to function in uncertainty, we need to have a high level of tolerance for ambiguity. And so a key thing to develop is our tolerance for ambiguity. And a great way of doing that is developing creativity, because being creative is very different to maths, where maths is like, 1 + 1 is 2, right? There's very little ambiguity there. Versus with creativity, there is a lot of ambiguity. And so therefore developing that skill sets you up well for dealing with a world that's very uncertain and has a high level of ambiguity.
Awesome. We've got a few quick fire ones for these last few minutes, Nelson. One is curious to know what would be considered as relevant data to help determine your L&D strategy and initiatives.
Yeah, so let's bucket this. The first one is performance data. Right. So how often are you looking at actual performance and productivity data to inform and back your L&D strategy? So going back to my sales example, are you looking at sales performance data? If you're looking at a customer support, are you looking at ticket resolution data. So that's one type of data, performance data. Then obviously what we've been talking about today around skills data, right? Are you able to connect the data around where is someone's skills proficiency? What gaps do they actually have? So that data. There's also behavioral data, right? For example, if you're trying to tackle burnout in your organization, you might look at data around, who are the people who are sending messages out of hours on Slack or Microsoft Teams or via email. And so there's behavioral data that you can also look at. Often, the misconception is, I don't have this data. Reality is your organization has a lot of data. It's just probably not as accessible, or you might not be speaking to the people who have access to that data. And that's why it's really important with an L&D role to make sure you're building those relationships with business stakeholders who have access to that data to really validate and support your L&D strategy.
Cool. That might actually link to this other question. It's around how we can change the mindset of those executives who still believe that if we provide employees with skills development, that they'll leave. But it sounds like from that approach, if we're using them to leverage the right data, then we are getting them in at the right stage that they see how it's going to influence employee growth that might keep retention.
Yeah, I don't think I could say it better than that age-old saying. If you're worried about what if they leave after investing in their skills, my bigger concern with is what if they stay, right? You know they've got these skills gaps, they're not building the skills they need, and they're still in your company. That's a far bigger concern, or should be a far bigger concern for an executive than helping this person build the skills, get them to perform better, and they're going to leave, right? And there could be a bunch of different reasons for why someone leaves, but building the capability as an organization to make sure whoever is in your organization, you're able to get them to have the skills they need to get the task done, is far more critical because you're setting yourself up for a more sustainable future where it doesn't matter people coming and going, but you're always going to help them build the skills they need to deliver your strategy.
Cool. Two very final ones. One is, do you think there's any differences between how skills-based learning might look for a company that delivers professional services, i.e. consultancies, versus a company that's driven by product? In terms of the approach, I wonder if the fundamentals stay the same, but do you see any differences?
No, I don't, right? It's fundamental. You might have different skills at play based on, are you selling a service and delivering the service versus you're selling a product and maintaining a product. So
Mm.
the skills would vary, but the approach to a skills first approach to L&D, I don't think changes. And so it would be the same playbook,
Yeah.
just the details of the skills changing.
Yeah, maybe the application is what changes a little bit. Like if you're a consultant, the skills you built and the tests that are there to help you apply them, or the learning that helps you apply them and build the skill is, I guess, just different than if you're selling a product. Last but by no means least, Nelson, do you think it's important to put some emphasis on employees taking charge of their own learning and skills journey instead of it just being led by the L&D and HR team?
100%. 100%. This goes back to the change in mindset and the perception of L&D. I think it's very dangerous to have a perception where L&D own L&D, right? They're the facilitate, they're the enablers of learning and growth to happen in your organization. But learning and development don't own it. They're there to help you take the friction out of learning and growth to happen in your organization. But a big part of this needs to come from ownership of the employee, right? If what they need to want to grow, learn, and build the skills they need. And you need to be in a position where you take the friction out for anyone who does want to grow and has that initiative. You're taking the friction out of that happening. The same is also true for people managers, right? Who I often think get overlooked, but they play one of the most important roles in a successful learning culture, right? Because they create the immediate conditions and environment for that an employee operates within, right? They create that psychological safety. They ensure that it's okay for you to try what you've just learned, get it wrong, and get feedback. They make it a priority for you to learn and grow. And so you also need people managers to co-own someone's development with the employee. But it's very difficult for you to be able to build the skills an individual and an organization needs without setting the expectation that an employee does own their own learning and growth.
Awesome. Nelson, we're bang on time. We've covered a lot today, so appreciate your time and all your insights. Thanks to everyone who joined us. Like I said, if you want more data, but also the playbook on how you can implement skills-driven L&D and skills-driven growth, then that link that I put in the chat is your place to go. But other than that, thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely. Cheers.